Chair, we have started.
Thank you. I want to welcome everybody to the Audit Committee of the California State Bar Board of Trustees. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded, and I would like to start by requesting a roll call, please.
Buenaventura, Harrison, Huser,
Here.
Stevens. Stevens, you're on mute.
Here.
Thank you. And Tony,
Present.
you have a quorum.
Thank you very much. I want to welcome everybody to the meeting. We had a little glitch last time we met. We met a week ago, and it turns out that our Zoom platform was having an issue where we started the meeting and there was no public there, and we were trying to figure it out. And we ended up deciding that we were not able legally, because of Bagley-Keene guidelines, we were not able to have a meeting, and that we adjourned to today so that we could have a meeting in which the public was available to watch it. So I apologize to those of you who may have tried to tune in last week and ended up not being able to find us and wondering what in the world is happening. So we did not do the meeting without you. We postponed it so we could do it with you. And before I get started, I want to introduce our new executive director for the California State Bar, Laura Enderton Speed, and give her a moment to say hello.
Thank you, Trustee Tony. I am well into my second day at the State Bar. I'm very excited about our work, and I am happy to be here and continue collaboration as we move forward.
Thank you very much. So the first order of business is the call for public comment. We offer public comment both in Zoom and over the phone. And, you know, most of you who've used Zoom know you have the little raise hand function at the bottom of the screen that you can tap. And if you happen to be calling by phone, you do the same thing, that is raising your hand by pressing *9, and then you got to hit 9 again, and then we know you want to give public comment. So I'm first gonna turn to our committee coordinator and ask if we have any previous signups. That's my first
We do not have any previous signups.
Okay. Do any of the trustees who are attending have any public commenters at your locations from which you are joining this meeting? Does not appear to be. I don't either. And so let's see who we have who's interested in making public comment. You've got 2 minutes, unless you have contacted us ahead of time to request an accommodation, in which case you will have 3 minutes. There'll be a counter that you can see so that it'll help you keep track of your time. So who do we got? Who's up for public comment here?
The first public commenter is Mr. Kai On. Kai, your mic has been enabled.
Welcome, Kai.
Good afternoon, all members. My name is Kai On from Sacramento. I would like to talk about State Bar's integrity issue. Sacramento DA office and police provide me fake information about the death of my father's Woon Kong on DA case number 99F08735. I filed complaint to State Bar against Sacramento DA Mr. Tieno and Attorney General Mr. Robert Bonter because they did not investigate. I report the incident to their agency back in January 2024. In February, State Bar used an incorrect reason to dismiss my complaint and claim it is a civil matter. Then State Bar intentionally keep delaying to process my complaint review request. In September, State Bar closed my complaint without reviewing DA case 99F08735 to confirm my father, Woon Kong On, was the victim and Jung So Fong was sentenced for hit and run that killed my father in the case. Also, the letter from State Bar has no name, no title, and no signature. I cannot verify if my complaint were closed by authorized staff in State Bar. State Bar is helping to cover up a Sacramento law enforcement scandal. I have requested an internal investigation, but it didn't happen. I emailed the evidence and the detail to this committee last week. All committee member, the State Bar that you are serving has misconduct issue. How State Bar is qualified to exam and regular licensed attorney in California. P helps to uphold justice and peace, ensure an internal investigation will be conducted inside State Bar. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comment.
And next public commenters, phone number. Do we have any other public comments? Please raise your hand. Okay, I don't see any more public comments.
Okay. I'll just give it a quick minute here. See if there's anybody else who is part of the public who would like to make a public comment. Now is the time to do it. Okay, with that, I will close public comment and move on to the rest of the agenda. All righty. I'm going to start with approval of the September 4th, 2025 open Senate session minutes. That's the first item of the agenda. And I'd like to know if there are any corrections or modifications anybody would like to make to the open session minutes.
So moved and no corrections.
Thank you. Trustee Stephens, who has made the motion.
I'll second.
Thank you, Trustee Huser, for seconding it. May I ask for a roll call, please?
Buenaventura is absent. Harrison is absent. Huser,
Aye.
Stevens,
Aye.
Tony,
Aye.
3 ayes. The minutes have been adopted.
Thank you very much. Next up on our agenda is approval of the 2025 Q3 Board and Management Travel Expense Report. This covers the time period between July 1 and September 30, 2025. Do we have a presentation on this one? Thank you.
Yes, I think our controller Coco Zen is going to be promoted, and there she is.
Excellent. Welcome, Coco.
Oh, hi, everyone. Good afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you for joining.
Oh, hi, everyone. I'm Coco Zhang from the Office of Finance. This agenda is to request for approval of the 2025 Q3 Management and Board of Trustees Travel Expense Report. I don't have a PowerPoint slide to share, but I will just go over it at a high level. This report comprises 3 attachments, including the cash reimbursement, the P-card or purchasing car expenses, and also a list of direct billing paid to a travel agency for airfare purchases. So there's a total expense of like $20,997 for the 3 months period ending on September 30th, 2025. You could refer to the attachments for further detail and information. So with that, I'm happy to answer any question that you might have regarding that report.
Thank you very much. Open it up to questions, of course. Trustee Stevens.
I did notice that there are a few straggler charges that it's either a typo or there were charges from 2024. And I just wanted to check in about those.
The original transaction like occurred in 2024, but like those there were because due to the staff turnover and like as also noted, one of them like is an exception, so it took a longer time to gather more information and also making sure the state bar get reimbursed for the full amount. So there was some like delay in including this in the previous quarter's report, but now as everything got resolved, so we are including it in the Q3 2025.
Thank you for the question, Trustee Stevens, and thank you for the response, Coco. Okay, Trustee Hooser, do you have any questions?
No questions, thank you.
Okay. I don't have any questions on this item. And I would, in the absence of any other questions, be happy to entertain a motion.
I'll make a motion.
I'll second.
Thank you, Trustee Hooser, for making the motion. Thank you, Trustee Stevens, for seconding. I think we're ready for a roll call, please.
Buenaventura is absent. Harrison is absent. Hauser,
Aye.
Stevens,
Aye.
Tony.
Aye.
3 ayes, 0 nays. The motion carries.
Okay. The next item we have is a discussion with Macias, Gini, and O'Connell. That is our CPA firm regarding the 2025 fiscal year audit plan. And it looks like we have, welcome, Annie Louie. If you'd introduce yourself, and it looks like we have Araceli Montoya Chico. So whoever is going to introduce this, you can introduce yourselves and go ahead and walk us through, please.
I was just going to very briefly introduce Annie, since this is really her presentation to the Audit Committee, but I think maybe perhaps everyone else here has met Annie before in other presentations. So maybe I'll just turn it over to Annie, who's obviously our audit partner and oversees all of the financial statement audits.
And Araceli is the Chief Financial Officer for the State Bar.
Yes.
So go ahead, Annie.
Thank you, and thank you for having me today. My name is Annie Louie. I'm the engagement partner for the State Bar's financial statement audit, as well as the audit of compliance with federal awards. I have prepared a short presentation today to cover our audit planning for the fiscal year 25. So let me share my screen. Can everyone see the PowerPoint slide okay?
We see you started screen sharing. Here we go.
All right, perfect. Right. So in terms of the items that I'll go over, here's a quick agenda. It's pretty similar to what we have presented on prior year. This is really the official kickoff of our audit process for 2025. This is the key individuals on the team. I am the returning engagement partner. This is my 3rd year now on the State Bar's audit. Ian Chim is the returning engagement director, and then Andy Long is our IT representative in case there are any issues that come up in terms of our IT assessments, which I'll cover in the next few slides. I wanted to give an overview of the audit process, what we're engaged to do, and what we will provide at the end of the audits. So on the left side here of the slide, you'll see our scope. We do have 4 separate audit deliverables. One is obviously the basic financial statements for the State Bar. The second item is the statement of expenditures of mandatory membership fees. The third item relates to the Legal Services Trust Fund program. And then the last one is the single audit, which is the compliance audit over federal awards. Now here you see that it may not be applicable this year because the federal guidance have changed on how major programs are determined. So the threshold for a single audit has been raised from what it used to be $750,000 in the past to $1 million. So depending on the federal expenditures incurred by the State Bar for year 2025, we're not expecting a single audit at this point, but obviously the year is not closed yet. If things change, the State Bar may become subject to the single audit. So currently our engagement letter is drafted to include the single audit in case one is necessary. The objectives of an audit is to provide an opinion on the fairness of the financial statements, as well as compliance with applicable requirements. We will provide an in-relation opinion on supplemental information. In this case, it would be the schedule of expenditures of federal awards for this or the CFA for the single audit if one is necessary. And then in terms of other information in the report, we do read it to ensure consistency with other information that are provided in the same report. And if there are any inconsistencies, we would bring it up to management's attention and resolve it accordingly. At the end of the audit results, you will get a report in each of the audit scope. So we'll have an independent auditor's report on the financial statements. We'll also provide internal controls and compliance reports that is required under government auditing standards. And that report will cover any internal controls or compliance issues that we may discover as part of the audit processes. And then we will also issue 2 examination reports on the mandatory membership fees, as well as the Legal Services Trust Fund. And then lastly, the report to the Board of Trustees is our direct communication back to the board for any significant matters that we may have come across as part of our audit process. This is an overview of our audit timeline, and on the next slide, there will be more information on what goes on in each of the phase of the audit. We start planning around now, so before the year is over, this is the time where we do a lot of research on what's happened during the year. We do preliminary analytics to identify certain risk areas or unusual activities, and this is also the time where we meet with management as well as representative of the board through the Audit Committee to get your perspectives about risk areas or other significant events that may warrant further attention. After the year is closed in December, we'll also work with management to conduct what we call interim work. And this is the phase where we may perform certain types of control testing to validate that controls are operating as designed. And that includes controls over the information technology systems as well. We disappear for a little bit, give management time to close the books, and then we typically come back and start the final field work around February to March timeframe. And around that time is when we focus on validating year-end balances, going through testing and reviewing support for the financial statement amounts. That takes about a month or so, and we work with management to draft the final audit reports. And this is where we communicate any particular audit issues or recommendations that we have to validate the facts and communicate our recommendations if one is warranted. And then finally, we will report back to the Audit Committee on what the audit results are. As I mentioned, this slide provides a little bit more details on what goes on each of the phases. It's just as what I had covered. So I'll move on to the next one. I won't read through this slide, but this is a summary of what is detailed in our engagement letter on what the auditor is responsible for. As I mentioned, our objective is provide our audit opinions on whether the financial statements are free of material misstatements or whether there are any compliance that need to be reported for the respective audits. And as part of the audit, we do review internal controls for planning purposes and to evaluate accounting policies and estimates. But I do want to highlight that the purpose of our review over internal controls is not to provide an opinion on internal controls. If we do identify any significant deficiencies or other recommendations, we will report that in our final report to the board. We also check for consistency and communicate the audit scope and timing and any significant findings to the board through the audit committee through this process. Management's responsibility, on the other hand, is to prepare the financial statements. To emphasize that management, the financial statements as well as compliance is management's responsibility. We also look to management for maintaining effective internal controls and informing us of any known or suspected fraud in relation to the financial statements, as well as assessing the State Bar's ability to continue as a going concern. And that is not because there are any particular issue, that is a standard process under the audit. And just to take it a step further, I do want to mention that we also look to the audit committee or the board of trustee to set that tone at the top as the governing body that is responsible for overseeing the integrity of the financial reporting process, and also to ensure the effectiveness of internal controls and facilitating any communications between the board and the auditors. As part of any audit process, I do want to highlight the concept of materiality. Audits do not provide absolute assurance, but reasonable assurance. So we design the audits to catch any material misstatements or material non-compliance, and we apply the concept to each phase of the audit as well. At the end of the day, what we do is if we have any misstatements or non-compliance, we would accumulate that and consider whether the identified misstatements individually or in the aggregate would cause the financial statements to be considered materially misstated, and we would work with management to correct any material misstatements that might be found. Okay. Lastly, I typically close the presentation with upcoming GASB pronouncements. So these are accounting standards that may affect the State Bar's financial statements on a go-forward basis. There is one that is effective for 2025, and that relates to certain risk disclosures regarding constraints on concentrations that require disclosures in the financial statement. The other two, GASB 103 and 104, are for financial reporting model, as well as disclosures that relate to certain types of capital assets, and that will be implemented in the next fiscal year for 2026. That concludes my presentation. I will take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Annie, for that clear, succinct, and precise presentation. So I want to open it up to my colleagues for questions. Yes, please, Trustee Stevens.
Just a quick question, Annie, on the IT and the cybersecurity. Again, that's a review for materiality and right. And I think you have somebody on staff who has the credentials to do that kind of review.
Yes, and I'm also certified in information system auditing as well. So typically what we go through is what I call IT general controls. So what you mentioned in terms of cybersecurity, some of the basic controls is covered. We make sure that the State Bar has those type of procedures and policies and procedures in place, and we do some of the basic testing to make sure that controls are designed or operating as designed. If there are significant issues or areas where we believe may warrant a further look, we do have an IT team on board that can focus on specific areas depending what the specialization might be necessary for.
Excellent. I appreciate that. Thanks. And the are there any current concerns about the GASB accounting that has to be done with respect to those particular properties or anything along those lines?
I would say no. We have been working with management on the ones that are up and coming. At this point, we don't expect any significant impact to the financial statements as you are used to seeing them. Right now, the disclosure, the GASB 102 is more on any constraints that might require disclosure, but not necessarily affecting the financial statements itself.
And I have absolute confidence in the State Bar staff led by Araceli, our CFO. but I always like to ask, are you having any issues with communications with staff?
We are not. We're happy to work with fortunately, the finance team and Araceli has been very cooperative and very informative. I'm sure if there are issues that, they will let you know, and I will have a direct line to the audit committee if that does happen, but I don't see any situation that would warrant such discussions at this point.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you for those questions, Trustee Stevens. Those are really good questions, and really good responses, Annie. Trustee Huser, do you have any questions at the moment?
No questions, thanks.
Okay. I have one question. We may not have to do the single audit, which we had originally, taken into account. So if it turns out we're not required to because we do not receive the amount of federal funds that triggers that requirement, what's our discount going to be?
Great question. And I know Araceli is just jumping to answer that. Our contract does have each of the deliverables separated. So in the event that a single audit is necessary, you will not be charged such fees.
Okay, well, that's good. I thought that was the case for my memory, but I think it's good because not everybody has looked at the contract or gets a chance to have on the record that if there is a substantial part of work that you're not doing, that we wrote the contract in such a way that the cost would be less because the work is less, the deliverable is less. And I think that's a good part of prudent contracting. So thank you for confirming that. I appreciate it. All righty. This is a discussion item only. There is no action required. So I want to give one more chance just in case anyone else has another question or comment. Okay. Well, with that, I want to thank you, Annie, for your presentation. I want to thank you, both Araceli and Coco, for attending, for your presentations, and most importantly, for your day-to-day work, making sure that the finances of the State Bar are managed well, are accounted for precisely, and we, as trustees and the public, can rest assured that the money that we do have is being wisely stewarded. So thank you very much. Okay, with that, I think we can go to the next item, item 3.3, which is an update on the Office of Compliance, from the Office of Compliance regarding the 2025 work plan.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon.
Welcome.
Thank you. My name is Lila Hyde. I am the new-ish lead of the Office of Compliance, which is housed within the Office of the Executive Director. I think I met you all at the Board of Trustees meeting in September, but this is my first time participating in an audit committee meeting. So I'm really happy to be here and present some updates from the Office of Compliance. This update today serves as the committee's annual report from the Office of Compliance, and I will very briefly share some updates from the year and the office's priorities for the remainder of 2025. As you all know, the State Bar's Office of Compliance has been intermittently staffed, resulting in an inconsistent implementation of the office's work plans. The office's lead position was vacant from November 2024 until August 2025, with other staff, of course, covering essential functions during that time. But with the lead position now filled, the Office of Compliance Lead and the Deputy Executive Director have developed a work plan for the remainder of the year. Some key projects from the last 2 months have included developing a 2025 work plan and identifying key priorities, developing preliminary standard operating procedures for recurring office activities, and launching the annual SDTC random audit and the biannual OCTC random audit. Some key priorities for the remainder of 2025 include developing an initial framework for internal compliance reviews of different functional areas of State Bar offices, conducting an annual analysis of the reasonableness of costs billed by SDTC, and conducting a license and subscription analysis to ensure that recurring expenditures are appropriately monitored. There's, of course, additional information in your staff report, but I'm happy to take any questions now.
Thank you very much, Lila. And I'm going to open it up to questions from trustees, from my colleagues. I don't see any questions forthcoming. I don't have a question on this item either. So with that, I want to thank you for attending. I want to welcome you to this position and look forward to future updates from you. So thank you. Okay. So I believe the next item on our agenda, since that was just for discussion and not for a decision or approval or anything, is item 3.5, which is the discussion and potential approval of the generative AI governance framework. And you know what I might do? I might ask.
Chair Tony?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, if I may, I think we've missed item 3.4, which is the
Oh, did we?
pending state auditor responses.
Oh, we sure did. Thank
Which
you.
is why Lila's still here, because that's
Oh,
also
thank
her
you.
item.
I'm sorry.
No problem.
Look, item 3.4, thank you for the reminder. And Lila, please, this is the pending California State Auditor responses. So, floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, today I'm going to provide a brief update on the status of open recommendations from prior performance audits of the State Bar conducted by the California State Auditor. As you all know, the Board of Trustees contracts with the California State Auditor to conduct biennial performance audits of the State Bar's operations. And like all audited entities, the State Bar is required to provide an annual update to the California State Auditor regarding recommendations that are not fully implemented after more than 1 year following the issuance of state audit reports. Since we last reported to you on pending recommendations last year, the State Bar resolved 9 of the 10 open recommendations requiring an annual response to the auditor. The remaining open recommendation comes from an auditor report issued in April 2021. The report findings stated that the State Bar's changes to its discipline system reduced that system's efficiency, and the auditor recommended that the State Bar assess the impact of its discipline system reorganization and determine whether additional changes to its organizational structure are warranted. In our response this year, we will be providing some data from the upcoming annual discipline report, showing how organizational changes have worked to improve case processing efficiency. And the language of our response can be found in your staff report.
Thank you. So I'm going to open it up again to any questions from my colleagues. Yeah. Yes, Trustee Stevens.
Leila, you may not be able to speak to this, right? Because it's an audit response, but as a practical matter, case levels have increased. And so that has a direct impact, right, on the ability. Are you still nonetheless seeing, hopefully, an improvement given the changes in processing?
Erica, I'm not sure if you want to answer that since that data hasn't been published yet in the report.
So I think we can, and actually George is waiting in the wings to answer any questions since this concerns really his office that is being that is subject to the responses here. So Angela, if you don't mind promoting him, and hopefully he heard that question. But this is all information that will be part of the annual discipline report that will be reported out to the entire board at the November 20th and 21st meeting. And I see George here to say.
Right. And I get that it's totally just spitballing, but it would be nice to have some sense that, right, the changes that are implemented are actually working, acknowledging the fact that the case numbers are going up.
So
Well,
I did hear the question. Thank you. And in fact, in the response that Lila has put in the staff report that was provided, we do note the increase in the number of cases. So we note, for example, that for fiscal year 2025, which is the data that's going to be in the upcoming ADR, the number of incoming cases increased to 21,205, which is a new record. Despite that, there's also data in the ADR that does suggest some improvement, although obviously not as much as we would like to see, in part because of the increase in cases. But there are at least some trends that suggest that there are improvements. I would also note that the 2021 audit in April of 2021 was referring to organizational changes that were made prior to 2021. Since then, there have been significant additional organizational changes. So we made organizational changes up through and including July of this year in light of the voluntary reduction in force. So the organizational changes are ongoing, as are internal procedural changes with the goal of increasing efficiency. It's kind of an ever-changing world in which we're working based on both what's coming in and how we're trying to address it.
And I think, George, if I'm correct, right, in 2021, there was nowhere near 20, we hadn't cracked the 20,000 ceiling for new cases.
That's correct.
And then you smash that together with staff reductions and you've got kind of a perfect storm.
Yes, and in addition to that, in the post-Tom Girardi world, we also made significant changes to our procedures to try and ensure that our investigations were more thorough, which is also sometimes contrary to trying to speed them up. So there's all of that working in, and we tried to explain all of that to the auditor in our April 2024 report. But we did note, as noted, that at the time, many of the organizational changes, many of the more recent organizational changes had not had time to sink in and be fully assessed. So I think that's what the auditor is looking for more time for us to have data to assess the impact of the more recent organizational changes, which we hope to have over the next year or two.
Thank you very much for that question, Trustee Stevens, and thank you, George, for that answer. I think that the California State Auditor is, acting fairly in asking the question and in, asking for more information before certifying that this issue has been resolved to their satisfaction. And I appreciate that, George, you're working to get them the data that they're asking for. Trustee Hughes, do you have any questions on this item?
No?
Okay. Well, great. This, again, is a discussion item only. There's no action needed on this item. So it sounds like there's no further questions. And I want to thank both George and Lila. I hope I've made sure you got all your pieces done this time. Thank you for your patience with me. And thank you, Erica, for reminding me when I skip something over. I appreciate it. All right, then. Thank you. All right. I think we then get to go to the Erica, I want to ask you a procedural question.
Sure.
And that is the annual work plan. how important is that to get done this time? Because I anticipate there will be a longer discussion on 3.5, and I want to know if 3.6 is quick and you want to do it now and switch orders, or you're fine to have it happen later. What is your recommendation?
So this is just to provide the audit committee with an opportunity to start discussing and considering what the audit committee wants to be on its work plan. So we could certainly table this to a future audit committee meeting. Ultimately, the work plan is something that's typically been approved by the executive committee at their February meeting. So there's time here. So this could be something
Okay.
that's either tabled or I could do it very quickly.
Okay, well, in that case, let me go ahead and go to the discussion of the generative AI governance framework. I know it's an issue that, some of us may have questions on. So if we can go ahead and get that presentation started and then open up the discussion on that, I'd appreciate it. Welcome.
Hi, everybody. Nice to see you all again.
Nice to see you.
I'll get to sharing my screen.
Thank you, Helen. Just introduce yourself.
Yeah, definitely. Hi, everybody. I am Helen Peterson. I lead our Office of Operational and Digital Transformation here at the State Bar. I will be presenting our generative AI governance framework today. So I will get us started. Just as a reminder about where this all comes from, in the audit committee's work plan, they have requested the development of a comprehensive reporting guideline for offices using AI and how we are using it, a monitoring framework for AI system performance, as well as compliance. And finally, really, how are we going to report about our use of generative AI? So this is really where this all began, and our framework really focused on making sure we're meeting this request. This slide, which you all did see a version of in September, is a summary of our governance framework. So there's really three parts of this. Number one is, how do we identify use cases and select a system? Then how do we monitor that system for things like, risk and bias and performance and security? And three is, how do we report about how we're using generative AI? So when we think about number one, how do we identify and select? Really what we're trying to do here is create a repeatable process where we are continually identifying use cases for generative AI, which is really what's happening in that identify category. We're reviewing the business case, and a big addition from what we saw in September and what I showed you all in September is this is really where we'll start to do some risk classification. So really understanding what kind of data would we be using in this system, in this use case, who might it impact, and really starting to put a classification around what our risk tolerance is for this. The third part is really selecting a solution and getting approval for it. So here's where, again, we'll really build out what are those risks, what are the performance indicators that we really want to hit with this, why are we using it at all? And we also really don't want too many generative AI systems. So understanding based on the use case, do we already have a system that could do this? So that, that just makes management easier. And so keeping that generative AI usage inventory live and bumping up use cases against what we already have. And part of this is the development of this generative AI review staff committee, who would be looking at these use cases, looking at what we're selecting as a solution before we launch and before we buy anything, to make sure it's aligned with our strategic plan, our cybersecurity processes, all of those things, all that good due diligence. And then implementing. So we really want to standardize how we implement generative AI tools. And the big thing I'll call out here is this project policy template. What we are going to be expecting in that document is a really thorough understanding of what are we expecting out of this tool? How will we use it? So what are our protocols of human review? Who is allowed to review? Do you have to have training to do that review? What would it look like to ever get out of human review, which would take a lot. But also, how are we testing for bias? And so really starting to lay the prescription for how we're going to monitor this in the future. And then we get, once we've done that, once we get sign off there, we move into the monitoring framework in part two. And what we're doing here is using all of that great due diligence that we did in part 1 and monitoring based on that. So we are going to be looking at 30, 60, and 90-day performance summary memos to say, post-launch, how is this working? Is it working as we expected? Are there any course corrections that need to happen? And then on top of that, looking at every 6 months, a semi-annual assessment report. So that would be where this generative AI oversight panel would do an independent assessment of how is it performing based on what we documented in the first phase, and has anything cropped up that we weren't expecting, and how do we handle that new risk or that new problem that we're identifying. So, and then underlying all of that is how do we keep you all informed about what we're doing. And so this also lays out how we report out in a semi-annual audit committee report.
Thank you.
And this is just a really quick delineation between the two committees that we are proposing. So the Generative AI Staff Review Staff Committee is approval focused. So we haven't bought anything yet. We have not launched yet. Who is making sure that this is all aligned with our strategic plan and all our other things that we need to be checking. And then the Generative AI Oversight Panel is monitoring focused. So these are the people who are going to be doing those 6 months reviews, checking that the systems are all working as planned. So what you will see in your staff report is new since September. So we were thinking about how do we think about how this will actually be operationalized within the state bar. And so what we've created is a step-by-step guide of what a staff person would use to go from, I have an idea of maybe I could use generative AI this way, to actual, all the way through the process to monitoring and implementation. So this document, I think, really makes it real what this will look like at the state bar. It provides classifications, risk classifications, which I'll go over also in this presentation. It provides a checklist of specific deliverables that staff will be expected to provide and the monitoring requirements that they will have. I also think a big thing we are trying to communicate here at the state bar is the why behind this. Like, what are the risks? Why are we putting all of this framework around it? Because we take it very seriously. And so just making sure staff understand why all of this is required and where it's going. So, and then this is just a kind of reminder that this does not sit by itself. The AI governance framework is also aligned with our generative AI guidelines, which say how staff are allowed to use AI, the practical guidance for how to use AI in legal practice. We're currently developing a data governance framework that this will fit well within. And then our existing IT policies and employee handbook cover a lot of some of the risk and things we think about when we use tech systems. Okay, and so now I want to talk a little bit about this risk-based approach. These are new slides since we presented in September. And really the idea here is that the level of review should match the level of risk. And so we have 4 different levels of risk in our AI framework. The first is low risk. So this would be something where the outputs are only used for internal drafting purposes. They don't influence any kind of external communication, and there's full human review and full control over the final output. So this would be something like something that helps you write emails or creates a brainstorming. What's a good icebreaker for my team meeting. Those kind of things are going to receive ODT approval, and we'll do basic compliance verification, OGC, cybersecurity, those kind of things. And they'd be added to our inventory of AI systems that are being used, but they would not need to go through all of the due diligence. So this is meant to provide kind of a faster lane for these low risk systems. Medium risk is really those systems that, while they will have mandatory human review and approval processes, the content of them could become public. So this would be something like educational materials for attorneys, anything on our website. If we're using something to analyze large data sets of, anything that comes from the public, that would need to go through the full governance and monitoring framework that we showed in that summary slide. Now, there's 2 different kinds of high risk that we've identified, and I will say something can be both. It can be Both the first one is high risk because of the nature of the information it will be handling. So if something is going to be handling highly confidential, sensitive, or privileged information, not only does it need the full governance and monitoring framework, it also will have enhanced data security protocols. So that's kind of another layer of making sure that we're handling that data correctly. So examples of this are anything handling confidential complaints, or attorney-client privilege or confidential client information. Now, the other kind of high risk is based on the outcome that could come of that generative AI system or the level of human review. So this would be things that could directly impact or pose a risk to the health, safety, or rights of humans, including regulatory decisions, legal determinations, things like that. So examples would be anything that could influence admissions to the bar or professional standing, case analysis, or recommendations. So again, we're layering checks here. So not only would it go through the full governance and monitoring process we showed in our summary slide, it would also require board approval. And like I said, I think we probably will see a lot of instances where a high risk is both high risk because it's confidential and high risk when it's human review. Like I think those will overlap often. Now, so last slide is just kind of a reminder. So the way we're really thinking about this is all of that due diligence that we're doing when we do an intake form, when we do the solution selection and approval report and develop that project policy document, lays the foundation for how we will monitor post go live. So it will establish how are we going to develop error classifications, bias and risk management plans, and then we will develop, we will monitor based on what we've identified at that point. And at the bottom, you'll just see kind of how this would actually look in a year. You would see these performance summary memos every 30 days post-launch, and then 6 months after that, we would get reviews. And that is the end of the slide, and I would welcome any questions.
Thank you, Helen, for that presentation. It's very clear, very succinct. I appreciate that, and yet a lot of detail. And so I'm going to open it up to questions from my colleagues. Trustee Stevens.
I hate being that guy, right? I just have all
No, I love you being that guy.
Helen, thank you. It's really quite well done, and I was just kind of putting together some of the audit work that's going to be done by MGO and this work that you're doing, right? So do we have anybody plugged in or who will be plugged in who's already CISA and is going to be able to do those analyses kind of as we hit the ground?
Yeah, Erica, do you want to field this one?
So there's a team in the sense that, so it's not just Helen, as you may have seen in the committees that are instituted. So that includes, we have a cybersecurity staff member on within our team, within our Office of IT. And then we also have cybersecurity audits and those types of things. So I'm not sure if this gets to the level of expertise that you may be looking for, Trustee Stevens, but I do think that it's not being done. It's being done collaboratively, bringing in different people with different skill sets. So that includes the Office of Compliance, looking at it from like a, are we doing what we must do with certain restrictions that we have on data, for example. So within our statutory requirements for complaints and other, sensitive admissions related data and so forth, that's also being done in collaboration with Aline's team and the Office of General Counsel as well. So we have a group that we're pulling together because this is really the use cases for generative AI, as we're seeing, do not just impact one facet of an organization. It's really, many different people need to be pulled in to make determinations related to how this data is being utilized, where data is being utilized. I will say that there are functions, like Helen raised the example of, like, give me some good ideas for a staff icebreaker that, are just people that are kind of have hit their mental load and just need some creativity or new ideas that are not, hitting these risk thresholds that Helen identified that would warrant the need for a committee for staff committee involvement.
Thank you. Yes, Trustee Huser, please.
Yeah, how much are you coordinating with other, state entities or other third-party entities on these guidelines? Because it seems like, everyone is trying to develop guidelines for how to do this. I can look at something and say, well, is that really low risk to start your research with AI? That makes me panic, but I'm not a expert in this field. So how much are you doing best practices review with others?
That's a great question, Trustee. And I would say it really was where we started in looking at our AI governance plan was what are the leaders in this field doing? So I see the city of San Jose as a real leader in this field. So is the state of California. So we have talked to them about what they're doing. And I think the answer also is that this will continue to evolve as we keep an eye on those bigger trends. AI is going to change a lot in the next year. And this is meant to be adaptable to those changes. So definitely, and we will continue to be. We're on list hosts. We are keeping up with everything that's kind of going on in the market. Yeah.
Yes, please, Trustee Huser.
I just have one follow-up to that. How, I noticed you had third-party vendors like Claude or, whatever, I guess that's Anthropic's AI type thing. How are you making sure that the state bar's information is not being shared with their, machine learning or I don't know the right words, but what they're using to train their own models and that there's, a wall between, what we can do internally versus what they can use to share that information or train other models?
Yeah, that is part of what Aline's group and OGC reviews when we start to engage with these vendors, and that is a non-negotiable for us. I think Aline, I just saw you come off mute if you want to.
Sure. Our team, Trustee Huser, reviews the terms and conditions that are offered to see how confidential information is treated. Is it closed fence environment or as you said, is the machine being trained on our information? And if the answer to that is yes, that it's not an AI that we are able to use to input any confidential information for. I believe last year we worked with an expert outside counsel in this field to just kind of get a sense of this terminology and these terms of what best practices involved in review of these types of arrangements and what kind of provisions would be most appropriate. And so one of the attorneys on my teams would review these terms and conditions and provide assessment of what they are contractually able or unable to do. It's also my understanding that from the cyber security standpoint, there is also a check from the IT end, and Helen, maybe you can speak more to that, but they also look at it from the IT perspective. We look at the legal terms, they look at the IT infrastructure and whether or not there's sufficient protections on that end.
Yeah, absolutely. And so IT can get a little more granular on how is our data being used and really kind of map out the flow of it. So for example, we are looking at some options and we know that if we were, to use them, there are features we would not enable as a part of that, as part of Aline's review, as part of IT's review. So that is something we're taking very seriously and looking at.
Thank you. Thank you. Excellent question, Trustee Huser. Thank you very much. Trustee Stevens, you have other questions? Trustee Huser, do you have other questions? All right, I'm gonna turn to myself on this. What I appreciate the most about this presentation and just the design and the advances you made since the last time we talked about this in September is the risk classification. That really stood out to me. I really appreciated both the definition, the review requirements, the examples, because it leads me to believe that this is a very thoughtful process And I think that speaks very well of the work that you're doing. I do have some questions. And the first thing I'm going to start off with is I went to I attended an AI presentation demonstrating the use of AI with the translation of complaints that come in languages other than English, and how AI is able to really speed the time that it takes to translate into English so that they can be further processed. And I think that's a terrific use of AI. It is clear that it's part of accountability to the public. And I remember it was also reviewed by humans before it was advanced. So I like that also. So with translation, could you tell me where that would fit in the risk classification?
I believe that would be high risk due to the confidential information nature of the complaints that they're transcribing.
Okay, okay. That's good to know. I wasn't sure when I was looking at this and the examples where that would fall. Okay.
Yep.
So, here's a question, and I kind of had asked this in September, and I don't quite see this listed, but I was hoping that there would be a list of items that might be considered off limits to the use of generative AI. And if I could give one example to start off with, I think the generation of bar exam questions would be a good candidate for something that ought to be off limits, that we simply should not be using AI for. And I wanted, I'm just give that example before I go further and pause. And I'd like to, get your thoughts about that, Helen.
Yeah, our effort in the high risk due to outcome section was kind of meant to move towards what you were asking for. So, and we're welcome to like rethink that. I think our thought was if it was high risk, it would come to the board for approval before it would ever, be pursued. So we saw that as the board's input side. And I don't know, Erica, if you have thoughts on kind of a list of not allowed.
Yeah, so I think dependent upon the risk classification, Chair Tony, there is a requirement for board approval. So it's dependent upon if you want to start from the premise that it is the board has already made the audit committee, and likely ultimately the board would need to make this determination as well, I think, but I'll defer to Aline on that question. Whether you want to start from an area where there has already been a determination that some things cannot be done using generative AI, and then essentially staff would be presenting a request or recommendation to overturn that decision. Where we are now in the framework is it is not approved, but we would need to seek approval for certain functions. So I think it's just taking it one step further. You'd be essentially overturning a decision that you have already made as trustees versus approving something in the first instance. So it's a slight distinction there.
I want a little bit more distinction in the high risk categories, the confidential information and the outcome human review. That's how they're listed on this. And are they both considered equally high risk, or is one kind of like, high risk 1 and one is high risk 2 in terms of higher risk? Or do you see them as kind of more equal but distinct because of the nature of them? That would help me understand better.
I see them as different in the way, who do we need to be working with to make sure we're managing this risk correctly? So with the confidential information, it will be about working with Aline's team and IT and cybersecurity to make sure we're fully understanding what we're getting into. And then for the outcome human review, that's really about working with the board to say, is this aligned with how we want to operate as a state bar?
Okay, so which category would bar exam questions go in your categories?
Outcome human review. So that would go to the board for
Okay. I'm, when I don't read things and I'm just trying to think of them, I ask because I don't know what you're thinking. Trustee Stevens, please, I see your hand up.
No, Mark, I think you've hit a good and important issue, right? Is
Okay.
I think one of the things the framework could benefit from is an actual risk classification rubric or right, more specific identification in your very well done report of what is the method by which things are being classified, and what is the rubric that makes them fall into low risk, medium risk, high risk.
Yeah.
Just yes, please, Trustee Huser.
Well, the only thing I'm thinking with this is you come to us or you come to the board and you say, what should be low risk, high risk, what should be allowed or not allowed? I happen to agree wholly on the questions on the bar exam. Should not be allowed, but I don't know how to think about this. It's not my area of expertise. Is there any training or anything you plan to provide to the board or the audit committee on kind of why we should think of some things, in this area in some ways, what risks or pitfalls others have encountered, what some of our legal rights are? I'm thinking maybe an outside law firm or something, but I think it will, at least for me, I feel like it would be a challenge to say what should be in a particular off limits or other category without some more education.
Yeah.
I think that's something that we would need to explore, Trustee Huser, and figure out how we could do that. And if we're talking about legal risk and those types of things, how it would be presented to the board and in the appropriate setting to do that within.
I think that makes sense. It's a good question. I think this is my attitude on this is that the way that this is presented really helps me feel like there's a pathway to coming up with a plan that I know I can support.
Okay.
All right. And that's coming a long way, I will just say. I am no fan of AI. Okay. And people know that about me. And I am an AI skeptic. Okay. But I also realize that there can be reasonable, prudent uses, and there's a way to create the guardrails, as you had said in your report. And I think we're approaching that. What I'm wondering is, my, I think what I'm wondering, I know that I would, for instance, um, so when I read the on the high risk outcome human review board approval, I was worried that if the board approved the policy, it meant the board approved it. I didn't know you meant board approval on a case-by-case basis.
Yes.
So that's an example of something that would help me and give me more confidence that I knew we were on the same, we had the same understanding.
Yeah.
Because
Okay.
now listening to you, I think you certainly seem to intend case by case.
Yes.
Absolutely. I couldn't tell by reading just the words. I read words, I don't know. And so that would be an example. And I'm, I would certainly feel more comfortable if that were the case also for high-risk confidential information, even if it meant because of the confidential information we're talking about, maybe that's in closed session. Okay, depending on the nature. I mean, we'll obviously have to follow the advice of our general counsel on that one. Okay, but I'm giving you an idea of and if there are, it doesn't have to be a long, exhaustive list, but I would, here's what I'm wondering. Before the state bar adopts a policy on this, I'm actually interested in knowing what the public thinks. I'm actually interested in having this go out for public comment. I think that would, there's a lot of support out in the world for using AI, and there's a lot of skepticism. And I think we will make a better decision when we look at and address what concerns people may have. It will make me feel better. And that's the direction I really want to go on this. I want to go in a direction where, perhaps you, Helen, based upon the input that you received at this meeting, could, tighten up here and there, okay? But that at the board meeting that we put this out for public comment, and ask the public, what do you think of this plan? What do you think the state bar should be using AI for? What should it not be? What should, just the basic questions that are out there when we put things out for public comment. People will figure it out, how to make their comments. But that would be the direction, as opposed to us actually just voting to adopt the policy in November. So that's what I'm thinking, but I really want to hear from my colleagues if you think I'm being reasonable, if you think there's another way to move forward on this. I'm going to start with Trustee Huser. What's your thoughts?
Well, I think the only problem is if you send out something, AI is such a big topic and such an evolving topic and all of that. If you send it out for public comment, it could absolutely overwhelm. And so I would rather see, following the lead of, if it's the city of San Jose or the state of California or something like that, and having some specific, tie to that, then having, I don't know how we would judge, some person in the public says you should use this, and some people said you should use that. I don't know how useful that would be. And I'm not sure how staff would deal with that.
Thank you, Trustee Hoover. You have an absolute valid concern, and I appreciate you expressing it. Trustee Stevens, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would share Mary's concern, and I also would be concerned about speed, because this needs to be addressed yesterday. So I think we need to be implementing and putting in place, and there will be opportunities to check tabs with the public, right? I mean, and folks will speak up when they see things. But if we're modeling best practices, I think that includes us getting it done just as quickly as we can.
If I may share, Tony,
Sure.
so a few thoughts here. One, it sounds like it could be helpful to have some specific examples in the different risk categories of actual state bar work. The bar exam issue, for example, is one that we could add in there. Thinking that this is something that, from what I'm hearing, that the full board would want to see at the upcoming November meeting. I think those are things that we could work to include and bring back and bring to the full board at the November meeting. And then that could be, to use an AI term, it could be fine-tuned and ultimately, perhaps adopted by the board. I think if it's something that is to be issued for public comment, to Trustee Stevens' point, the question is, what do we do right now? And as the audit committee and the board knows, we are operating with fewer staff than we have been in recent history, and trying to figure out how to accomplish some of the work that we are hoping to use AI to create efficiencies with, that is not in that bar exam scenario that you are concerned with, but is using it, using confidential complaint information for translations. That's something that we've already started exploring doing, and so are doing with appropriate disclaimers and so forth. And so I just want to be a little bit, I think it's a balance of trying to create efficiencies in a safe and transparent way, while recognizing that this is a new frontier, or a 2-year-old frontier that everybody is still trying to navigate and do so in a thoughtful and careful way. And so I think I would recommend that we at least take something to the full board, and see the comfort level of the other trustees with adopting something at that meeting versus issuing it as a policy, because this is a policy, not a rule, so it's not required to go out for public comment, and doing it in that fashion.
Here's what's interesting, and I really appreciate that, Erica. I will, just in terms of, doing the context. What I'd like to add for context is, this is, as far as I understand, an issue for the audit committee and going to the board, because it was something that I recommended be added to the audit committee work plan. And so on one hand, I think this is going to the board faster than it otherwise may have. So that's just one thought. But I wonder, is it possible, is this strictly a binary decision? Is this something where one decision has to negate the other? Is it possible for us to consider adopting the this policy on a interim basis in November that provides the staff the kind of direction that they're asking for, that would be useful for them, and to put it out for public comment. And then we have the option at a later point of modifying based upon the comments we get. So I want to suggest that there's more than one way to look at this, that it is possible to meet the need or the interest in acting and in not delaying our action. I think it's a good move to ask for public comment on this. I think it's a plus. I think it demonstrates a level of accountability, a level of we understand and we heard you on the concern about using AI for exam questions. And we are, we want to know what you think of our plans. Maybe you have things that we should be thinking about that we haven't. And, we can take that into account as we move forward. This is what we got now.
I think maybe it's something the chair and vice chair should discuss and come back and make a recommendation.
Here's what I would suggest. We have options, okay? I think what we have consensus on is that we have a pathway to adopting this for the board meeting. Okay, a version of this. Okay, it may get slightly tweaked at the meeting, right? When other trustees weigh in. But I think that the three of us who are here today for the audit committee have reached agreement that it would be useful for the state bar staff to have some guidelines. I think that part is seems to me to be what I heard. I think the only question is, would we benefit from also asking for public comment? And that we can leave for the discussion for the full trustees. I think that's fair. In the absence of a consensus here on that piece, and that's okay. All right. We can go to the board with the piece that we do have consensus on and say on the part that we don't, let's have it for a board discussion and decision. Does that sound acceptable? Okay. Okay. Procedurally, Erica, what do you want on something like this? Do you think that it would be good to have a motion that the audit committee recommends that the board adopt these policies, as amended, obviously, and that we want a further discussion on the question of putting them out for public comment?
So I was asking that exact question of Aline in a separate conversation.
Okay.
Is whether we need a motion at all on this.
Okay, I
Was
don't
kind
know.
of the big picture question versus whether it could just go. We could revise the item, indicate what happened at audit committee, and then have it go to the trustees. Aline, I'm going to put you on the spot right now if you don't
Yeah,
mind.
I just wanted to clarify if possible. So is the ask whether or not this governance framework could be adopted here at the audit committee, or Chair, is your desire to take the framework to, the board?
Oh yeah, it would only be a recommendation if anything.
Okay.
This is too important, in my opinion, for a
Mhm.
committee to making a decision on. I want the full board of trustees to feel like they had every opportunity to weigh in.
Given the language in the audit work plan, and if I'm looking at the correct version on the website, I think that the audit committee was tasked with instructing the staff on the various components of this governance plan. It would not be inappropriate for you to consider a motion to move this to the for the board's consideration with recommendations. The staff could also advance that at your direction here. We've heard you, but it may actually be more appropriate to have a motion to consider advancing the policy to the board with the recommendations of the audit committee.
I would feel more comfortable with that, and so that the board has the final say on this. And So, do we have to change the motion that we have in the agenda? What do you recommend?
Yes, I think it would need to be revised to say, resolve that the audit committee recommends that the board of trustees approve the state bar generative AI governance framework as included as attachment A. And I think that at that time, we could, in the staff report, tee up the discussion about public comment
Okay.
for the full.
Angela, oh, I'm sorry, Aline. If you scroll down, there should be an alternative resolution that may capture what you're trying to do here.
Thank you, Erica.
And you may just need to hit refresh because I just made some tweaks to it and I see that it's trying to save them.
Thank you.
And Erica, can you confirm that you did not use AI in generating your revised resolution?
I can. I'm not that quick with my typing. Let's see. Okay, so let me just send it to you via chat. I think that may be the easiest way, Angela. And we can see your whole screen, just so you know.
Okay, thank you.
Well, we can just delete from attachment, yeah. Okay.
And this is, of course, assuming that Helen will make, some clarifications that we talked about. But I think this looks pretty good. This is the text in blue that we are considering. I'd be happy to entertain a motion.
I'll move.
Trustee Huser moves. Trustee Stevens seconds.
Second, with the friendly addition about the risk assessment rubric that I suggested.
Okay. As amended to provide examples of specific and a rubric to just give the words.
A risk assessment rubric.
Okay.
Yeah.
At the end, and a risk assessment rubric.
Yep.
Trustee Huser, you accept that as a friendly amendment?
Yes.
Okay, in that case, I will ask Angela for a roll call.
Buenaventura is absent. Harrison is absent. Huser.
Aye.
Stevens.
Aye.
Tony.
Aye.
3 ayes, 0 nays. The motion carries.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate everybody's patience with the discussion. And I will go ahead and ask that item 3.6 be rolled over to our next agenda. That's the discussion of the 2026 Audit Committee Annual Work Plan. Before I wrap up, is there any other question or comment anybody has? Well, in that case, I want to thank everybody for attending on the panel. Thank everybody for attending in the public. And I will declare this meeting of the Audit Committee adjourned. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Good to see everybody.